Welcome to the Responsible Bytes podcast, everyone, the podcast where we talk about all things safe and responsible technology. I'm your host, Dr. Zena Assaad, and today I'm joined by Jessica Dorsey, Assistant Professor of International Law at Utrecht University, focusing on international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians. Welcome to the podcast, Jess.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited. I've been an avid listener for a long time, so it's cool to be part of this. So thank you.
I'm glad to have you on the podcast, and I think the timing of you being on here is perfect because you are coming off the back of a very long and intensive week at GGE Laws.
I am. Geneva is always intense. These meetings, it's a marathon, basically. You start Monday morning and you go all the way through Friday afternoon, and it's ups and downs. But I'm riding this wave of cautious optimism, to be honest.
I'm excited about the cautious optimism. And before we jump into why you're cautiously optimistic, do you want to just give a really quick explanation of what GGE Laws is for those who may not be aware?
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll roll out some of those acronyms. So it's actually not just GGE laws, it's CCW, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, part of the UN treaty system. Within that, they set up the Group of Governmental Experts on Lethal Autonomous Weapons Systems. So that's what we call the GGE laws, or the GGE. And they meet now several years. We're coming up on almost 10 years of discussions in this forum.
Has it really been 10 years?
It's been almost 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's been a lot of back and forth, trying to get to sort of a set of elements that may be used for an instrument without prejudging its nature, right? So there's been discussion whether it's going to be legally binding. Will it maybe take the form of a protocol to the CCW? We just don't know quite yet, but we are getting closer. And that's where, look, I'm always the optimist, perhaps naively so. But so I like to look for little glimmers of hope. But I was at the meetings in March as well. The first time in person. Before this, I've watched online, but there's nothing quite like being in the room and on the sidelines, the side events, the fringes. So I thought, looking at what came out of March and then moving towards September, and also understanding that the chair, the Dutch ambassador, Robert in Den Bosch, has really taken an innovative approach by establishing what he terms a rolling text. So basically, it's a Word document that's shown on the screen, fairly low tech in a sense, but trying to.
Ironically.
I know, yeah, it's pretty intense sometimes. But we have little technical glitches. I think that's like a metaphor for the process sometimes. But so establishing kind of where there's convergence, where states might be agreeing on certain definitions, understandings of what we're trying to regulate, if anything, and of course here. The mandate is set out for lethal autonomous weapon systems, and that is an important category of things to regulate. But as we know, work that you and I do together in the GC REAIM and beyond that's not the entirety of military AI. So it's just a small sliver of things that you can regulate. But I think it's actually been really helpful to see how states think through some of these issues, and also what kind of lessons we can learn from this forum to take over to larger military AI discussions as well.
So can you share with me then some of your reflections from the last week and perhaps a couple of key takeaways?
Yeah, sure. So we started off, I actually kind of got a bit nervous, let's say, in the early days. I think there's a nervous energy, but also kind of like, where are we going to go? The reason why there seems to be, and I should have said this earlier, the mandate of this particular session basically goes through 2026. So,
okay.
And that then the mandate may be extended. It's been extended in the past, but the idea is that I think the general feeling is that states want to produce something, some kind of takeaway before the review conference at the end of 2026. That means right now that we've finished the second session of 2025, we have 2 more sessions next year. So that's 10 working days plus informal consultations, et cetera. So it's not a lot of time. So I do think that there's a sense of urgency in the room, like we need to move forward to get there. So I think that underpins where some of the discussions started out. Some states were very keen to move it forward, to say, okay, we've got enough. Let's move this into negotiations of treaty text or some sort of binding instrument. Others were less keen. So what I thought was quite interesting at the very beginning of the week, we started opening up boxes I thought we had already closed. So the definitional discussion about what a lethal autonomous weapon system is in general. Like basically, the characterization was a lethal autonomous weapon system can be characterized as a functionally integrated combination of one or more weapons and technological components that can, and this is where the crux of the discussion was, we had kind of converged around select and engage a target. But before that, there's a lot of rumblings about whether that should actually include the word identify, select, and engage, or if the word select already encompass identify.
Do you know where this came from? Why the word identify wanted to then be integrated?
That is something that we're in the process. I'm trying to figure out exactly who introduced that at what point. But I think this is sort of that interdisciplinary character of the GGE laws. There's a bunch of lawyers in the room, which as a lawyer, I understand that that's not always a healthy approach. But it is a legal forum. We're talking about NHL, international military law. So we need to have some legal expertise. But I think a lot of this is trying to overlay these various disciplinary approaches. So when we're thinking about targeting law, when you're trying to find an adversary and eliminate that adversary, whether that's a person or an object, you can look at it through various lenses. From operational law, you're looking at the joint targeting cycle. You're identifying as in finding someone or an object that matches the profile that you want to eliminate. And that's like a physical process of getting eyes on or trying to recognize where that is particularly located. So that's sort of a legal way of approaching it or operational way of looking at it. There's also a technical way. Are you talking about a system that might perform object recognition, facial recognition? So is it more a recognize? And some people come from a philosophical perspective or an international relations perspective, and they look at this very differently. Same for ethicists, right? They're looking at, some people thought identify, on some side conversations I had last week, identify was actually the generation of targeting lists, right? So like coming up with names or objects. So understanding, just trying to get a mapping of what is it you're really concerned about. That was part of this discussion of whether or not those terms, identify, select, engage, encapsulated the problem, right? And for a while, we converged around that select included that identify, but we didn't even know, we're not really sure. I know what I mean by it, and you know what you might mean, but they're not the same things. And so absolutely, and this is part of it, but I'm not sure, certainly within the GGE laws, it's like a chicken or the egg thing, right? We're not yet negotiating a treaty. And so a glossary of terms, though that would be super helpful, is something I think better placed for an actual negotiation. We get too bogged down in the details of what the elements are that we're going to negotiate. I think you can put the cart before the horse. At the same time, if we can't rally around whether select includes and identify or doesn't, then that's a problem. And that's where we kind of got to on Thursday. That started making me very nervous. And it was also very interesting, and I noticed these kinds of things, but it was a very gray day outside on Thursday. We had beautiful weather most of the week. And then Thursday was a really rainy day. And we got to this place where we weren't sure how it were going to end up. People were feeling a bit down. Rain was pouring down when we left the building. And I think a lot of us were less optimistic. We thought, oh no, are we just going to be in this perpetual cycle of identify, select, and engage, and then we end up with nothing?
Can I ask you a question here?
Yeah.
So with this, identify, select, and engage, and kind of getting bogged down on this thing, sometimes, because I've been involved in some of these international forums, and sometimes I get the sense that the problem is so big that people get bogged down on a smaller problem they can actually address. And so it becomes a little bit of a distraction. Do you feel that way with this forum as well? And it's not to discredit the argument, right? Like, it is important to understand the difference between these terms and the kind of terminology that we use, and to make sure we have a collective understanding of that terminology. That's important. But the fact that we're talking about, how you've kind of cycled back and gotten bogged down a little bit on this terminology, do you feel it is a bit of a way to deal with a larger problem by trying to tackle what people perceive to be smaller problems?
Well, I think the tackling of the smaller problems, or what is perceived to be smaller problems, or the focus of where states are, I think that was done in service of, hey, let's address enough so that we can then move it forward, right? So, and I think that back to your original question, or what I picked up on that, I think there's a lot of reasons for states in the room to be focusing on one thing or another, and that comes from their own interests. And this is the political nature of these processes. Maybe there are states that obfuscate the meanings on purpose in order to slow down the process, because maybe they're not as interested or keen in moving towards something legally binding. There are states who perhaps have technologies that they don't really want to fall under these terms and conditions. And so in having that sort of as the underlying motivation for entering into this discussion, you see some of that come out, because you kind of think, wait a minute, we had agreed, but now you have state X who's now really focusing or really biting back into discussions we had thought we closed years ago, right? Because we're getting to that point, the urgency point, or the time where we're going to need to deliver something. So states are really moving toward having to show their cards. And just one more thing I should also mention about the CCW, this whole process, it's a consensus-based organ.
Okay.
So in order to get anything out of it, needs unanimity. That presents
Just quickly, how many states are involved?
I think it's something like 126 states.
Okay, so when we're talking about needing consensus, this adds a bit of context for people. If you've got over 100 states involved and needing consensus across the board, that's incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. And you've got major players in the room as well, and smaller states and mid powers, et cetera. So there's just a lot of, and I find that academically quite interesting. And I'm like an amateur anthropologist, like watching who's talking to whom. That's why being in the room is so valuable, because you just kind of think, oh, they're having a little sidebar over there. That's interesting. I wonder what. And then a couple minutes later, a new joint statement will come out, or a position might have shifted slightly. So watching that over the years, the arc of sort of how these conversations have gone has been interesting. So Thursday, we were at a place where it was like very reflected in the dark, rainy evening we all walked out into, and I thought, oh my gosh, where I need to get up.
The scene had been set for everyone.
It really had been, and it was almost theatrical, because that's how it felt. And we were soaked to the bone. We all like walked back down the hill with our umbrellas. It didn't matter. We were all just soaked and sad. And well, how are we going to pick this back up? Friday morning, the sun was out again. We walked back into that building thinking, okay, how's this going to go? We remember our rainy day yesterday. The ICRC came up with a brilliant text that became this sort of bridge, and it served as a bridge function. And of course, the ICRC is very good at these sort of bilateral conversations they were having with states to say, okay, well, where are your friction points with this identify language or not? Talking to a number of states, and then came up with a suggestion to have, under the definition, they included identify, select, and engage, and then they put a little 1 bis, sort of further defining the purposes of these elements. The identify function means a process where a system scans an environment for potential targets and matches a person or object against a target profile. And so that then became a no. Again, this is not set in stone. These are not negotiated terms, but that was sort of enough to kind of bring everybody back to, okay, we can maybe proceed. And that was something, and so, like I said, the metaphor, the sun was out, and this was a great way to bridge some of these differences in order to then progress a bit forward. And then at the end of the day, there was a joint statement that circulated. This is another takeaway, with 42 states that had signed on. So it's not everybody, but it's a sizable amount. And some of those states on there are larger powers. We've got France and Germany on there This was led by Brazil. We have geographic diversity, Peru, Kazakhstan, Austria, Mexico. I mean, just an interesting sort of motley crew of states who said, all right now at this point, Friday afternoon after the session, we have enough in this rolling text. There are enough elements, the skeleton is there, we can move to negotiations. And I think that's where my optimism comes from. I think, okay, we have enough clay, it's now time to start molding it into a legally binding instrument or some sort of negotiation of a protocol or treaty or format.
Which is what you're cautiously optimistic for.
I am. I'm ever the optimist. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, we'll see. So you've spoken a little bit about the multidisciplinary nature of this forum in particular. Can you kind of talk to what the role of that interdisciplinarity is for this forum? What role does it play and what significance does it have?
Well, as I mentioned, it's very lawyer heavy. And that is something that makes sense from a perspective that this is a treaty body that is there to ensure that IHL, international humanitarian law, is upheld. So you need the legal basis. But when we're talking about these systems that are so technically complex, I miss a lot of perspective from engineers and programmers, etc. And so that's when I start thinking we need people like Zena in this room. We need experts who are coming. And there are side events that are a bit more they're not quite academic, but they're much more, they do feel a bit like master classes because they bring in some of these perspectives, but this requires a level of nuance. We have diplomats in the room. They come from various delegations with various levels of expertise, and that has to do with some delegations have 10 people sitting there with all kinds of different expertise, and some have one who's there for maybe half a day because she has to go sit in different form, right? So that's a disparity that's also evident. So this area, as we know, if our work together, it requires stakeholder approach, interdisciplinary knowledge. It doesn't mean that I need to become a technician. It doesn't mean that you need to become a lawyer, but it does mean that we need to learn how to ask better questions, I think. So this whole discussion I just rolled out about the select, identify, and engage, that can be a lawyer-only conversation where we sit down and say, okay, where do we match this? Where can we find this in treaty text? Or is this coming from the legal or jurisprudence strand? But actually, when you start understanding through questioning why people are uncomfortable with a system that can select and engage without human intervention, you start unrolling things about the targeting process that they're uncomfortable with. And then when you're trying to say, well, that's a machine doing that, you need to also ask, well, how is a machine able to do that? That requires at least the ability to ask questions and listen, and then reflect on where my discipline stops, and where my talking should stop, in order to make space for understanding. Because then when I started keying it, oh, okay, that's why they think that's problematic. And that's the same thing I think that the NCRC went through, is thinking, okay, where are the problems? And then you start thinking of ways you can address that. And so you think, okay, if it's a target, if it's an object recognition issue, what word would we choose in order to address that in the context of this? How do we make sure it's clear, this is what we need, and this is what we're trying to regulate?
You've touched on the limited technical expertise that is often in these forums. And this is something that I've experienced. Obviously, my background's in engineering. And when I do attend these forums, I'm one of very few, often the only technical person in the room. And one of the things I personally find challenging is that the public narratives around these technologies have shaped a lot of people's understandings of them. And so a lot of people will ask me questions about this technology in a way that is not in line with the reality of how it works and what these capabilities are and are not capable of. So how have you found, in particular, we're seeing these technologies in current conflicts, so we are seeing what they are and are not capable of, and we're seeing them in practice. So how have you found misunderstandings of technology versus the realities of technology has kind of shaped and influenced the way that discussions happen in forums like the GGE?
Well, I think the fact that we spent 10 years focusing on systems, autonomous weapon systems, so those that can select and engage without human intervention. So basically, and like we've got the campaign to stop killer robots, that has really dominated the psyche. And it is not because it's not important, but it's become a real problem in the face of what we are really seeing, what the real issues are. So AI-enabled decision support systems that are reportedly being used in the conflict in Gaza, in Ukraine. We're using more advanced autonomy, and we're not quite talking about that, not certainly not at the regulatory level. And I think I think your point to what may underpin that is that there's a sort of fascination or an imaginary of what the real issue is because of the lack of technical understanding. And I get that, but at the same time, and that's why I try really hard, and that's why we lead a program at Utrecht called The Realities of Algorithmic Warfare. We're trying to look at what's really happening and try to cut through some of the noise. And that's also industry-led, understanding the promises that companies are rolling out in order to sell products. That doesn't necessarily match with the capes, the fog of war, the battlefield. Every single battlefield scenario, the environments are very different. If you're fighting in a desert area versus a forested area, the kinds of data that you're pulling from one is not going to be applicable to the other, not on a one-to-one level. Certainly, those are the sort of technical shortcomings that we need people like you to help us make sense of. And then once we see it, you can't unsee it, right? And that's the value. But I understand it's uncomfortable to dally outside of your own lane, to kind of push yourself to go beyond law or ethics or international relations or technology, but we have to do it. And the quicker we become more comfortable doing that, the better the higher quality the conversations will be. And that's why I look to you all the time to be like, okay, can you have a look at what I'm saying? Does this make sense from a technical perspective? And I'm very thankful that you're available and you make yourself available and you give up your time to kind of help me understand that. And I try to do the same for you. And I hope it's also valuable. But I'd be curious to hear like your read on this as one of the few technical experts. Like, how do you see this interdisciplinarity issue?
You know what's interesting to me? So I've reached out to you multiple times asking for clarification on this legal thing or that legal thing. And, you've reviewed papers for me in the past and provided your perspective. And I'm like, that's great because, as you said, my knowledge on a discipline that is not my own can only get me so far. What's interesting, though, about this particular field and AI in particular is I sometimes feel that the industry narratives that you touched on before have kind of run away from us. We've lost control of that narrative to a point that it is seeped and embedded in academic literature. And this is the thing that concerns me. Academic literature is supposed to be robust. It's supposed to be thorough. It's supposed to be peer reviewed. And so when I read academic publications that are so factually incorrect from a technical perspective, I wonder to myself, how did we get here? It's not that the authors are not intelligent people. They are intelligent people, and they've referenced and cited where they've gotten this information from. And if you go through, the citation rabbit hole of, well, how did that person get it and how did that person get it? You ultimately end up at a point that started with an industry narrative of this technology. And it's really concerning to me. And one of the things I always talk about with my colleagues often is we laugh a little bit sometimes at the sensationalism behind AI and autonomy. And while we can laugh about it, the reality is that we are seeing it really ingrained in this academic literature, and that starts seeping into forums like the GGE, and it's seeped into forums like GC Reaim, which you and I are both on. So you and I have both been in conversations where you've seen me try to pragmatically explain that scenario could not happen because it is not technically feasible. And it's not that the person who put forward that scenario doesn't know what they're referring to. It's that they have shaped their understanding of this technology based on a narrative that has just run away from us. I feel like it's gone too far for us to be able to pull it back. Now, I try my best to try and pull it back, and in my work I've tried to pull it back, but it's a real struggle, and I find myself a lot of the times in these forums, instead of having what I hope to be productive conversations, I'm having a lot of conversations of being like, actually no. And, oh, well, no, it doesn't work that way. And so I find I'm having a lot more of those conversations. And that's the difficult part for me. And I think it's the part of why we're not progressing in the way that we should be progressing.
I think, and I totally, I get that. And I see that happening certainly in, like, where we talked about the bounds of I think it was a conversation about AGI, and it got really, really control.
Super AI, which
Super.
that's not a thing. I just need to put that on the record. It's a marketing agenda. It's not real, but
But it
but
sounds
the
really
thing,
nice.
it sounds really wonderful. And the thing is, it's not real. And it is, it's a marketing agenda and a way to be able to sell what people perceive to be a different version of AI or a new product or whatever it is. But the person who was referencing it had referenced it from a peer-reviewed academic publication. And this is the problem, right? It's that person isn't the problem. It's the fact that this stuff is seeping into what is supposed to be robust and thorough academic publications.
And
Where did we get these words from?
I wonder about that because I think, and this is, I had this conversation actually because I cited, or I referenced the just like the informal nature of what you and I do. I say, hey, Zane, I need you really to look at this because I don't know what I'm talking about. And does this match with technical stuff? And I tried to do the same for you on the legal, but that's just like because we're friends and we're colleagues and we know one another and I have access to you, you have access to me. It has nothing to do with these peer review processes that are happening from like this ingrained system in academia. And we could talk about that, like maybe over a glass of wine at some point, about how broken that system might be. But
I
the
have
fact
so many
is,
qualms about that.
well, I mean, think about the problematic nature here is that like certain journals or certain strands or certain disciplines will have reviewers or lists of reviewers who they have very highly esteemed. People are very far in their careers, and those are the kinds of people you want to review your legal work, for example. But when it's crossing over law and technology, and you only have a set of esteemed reviewers, and you think of reviewers that are legal experts, you're already starting behind the times, right? Because what you should be doing is actually crossing over and dipping into that highly esteemed technical layer as a journal editor, right? And I don't have one particular journal in mind that I'm trying to point the finger at. But I
I
think
think it's
that
an all-round problem. I don't think it's a specific problem to one journal.
no, and I mean, and I don't think it's one specific problem to one discipline. I'm not sure how many technical journals who are having people write from a technical perspective on lavender or gospel are checking in with the legal experts to see what kind of,
Absolutely.
and I think that that's part of the issue. So then these things get through a peer review because from a legal perspective, it sounds right. And nobody checks the tech specs and the authors. I think it really is on us to do what you and I do. And it's a real low threshold. It doesn't cost us time. We just approach people who know things that we don't know and say, do you have time? And I'm also willing to do it for you. If that works, that already brings my work to a higher level. And I think more people should be willing to do that rather than waiting to say, oh yeah, but I wanted somebody with a technical background to review my work, but the journal didn't assign it to such a person. I find that a bit tricky because I think there's a lot in our own hands as academics that we can do as an informal check before it even goes to a peer review, right? Like get out there and ask the questions. If you're going to dabble in someone else's backyard, then you should ask, hey, is this in line with what's or what's not? Because then that's when we're going to start breaking through some of these narratives that have seeped through, I think. And I think that that's the only way to do it because we can't pull it back. Industry's not going to change their marketing language.
Well, no, it's been incredibly successful thus far, so there's no incentive for them to change it.
No, and then that's the thing we're looking, or I'm not expecting industry to do anything except for sell products, right? And whatever helps them sell products, if they want to use the scare tactic that super AGI is a thing, and then that's going to start forming the imagination. And I think that that does bring it back to the focus for the last 10 years on the autonomous weapon systems. It is maybe a thing we should be worried about, but it is not the only thing. And all of the oxygen in the room has been taken up by looking at this very small subset of things that might be used, maybe not, to the expense of the things that are being used. And I do make, like the work that we're doing on AI-enabled decision support systems, that's because that's what we're seeing being used at this moment. And there is no regulatory framework on that. We're not understanding it, and they're trying to do not only dabbling in the tech side of things, but also the psychology side, understanding how these things might be changing the way that we make decisions. But I'm doing that through trying to engage with colleagues at Utrecht University who are psychologists and ask, okay, what is the decision-making process? And what are these systems doing to push us humans to the margins? And how does that work psychologically? And then what kind of knock-on effects does it have for legal obligation? But that's hard. And it's hard for me.
It is really hard. It is really hard. And on the point that you were making around really industry and how much they have become seeped and embedded into not just the narratives, but also our understandings of these technologies. How are you seeing that seeping into GGE laws, in particular around the kinds of recommendations that they're making for states? And the reason I'm asking this question is because we're really seeing a much more intertwined relationship between industry and the military in a way that we haven't seen in the past, especially with these kinds of ubiquitous technologies. And so how is that changing the way that recommendations look when they come out of forums like the GGE?
I think that there is a hesitance to for states to want to tie their hands about technologies they already possess, are developing, or are in the process of acquiring or want to acquire, right? So the idea is that, and this is that narrative that we're also trying to push back on about the fact that regulatory schemes somehow hamper innovation. I find that, I feel like, why are we still having this conversation? But that
I roll my eyes every time somebody says it. I'm like, oh my
I
God.
feel like it's this is a conversation that's 10 years old and it's not going anywhere, and sometimes it's getting stronger. But the idea is that if we tie our hands, we can't be innovative, which we know is
I wrote an article that had a byline that mentioned this, and one of the examples I used was Uber. So Uber actually credits its successful scale to regulation. So that was part of Uber's model. It was part of their business model to scale in the way that they did, and it was through regulation. So it's not a proven fact that regulation inhibits innovation. It's not at all.
No, it doesn't. And the more that we look at it, it gives a clarity of a framework in which you can innovate very creatively, but within a bounded sort of framework. Like it will focus your work, and it will make your work, I don't know, I would also make an argument from a market perspective, is that if you are innovating within a regulatory framework that ensures that you are compliant with legal obligations, more countries will want to buy your product, right? So I feel that this whole understanding of, well, we don't want to tie our hands by regulation because we want to develop this. Like, what are you developing that you're afraid of the regulation, right? And if you're doing that, then maybe you have other questions, like have a look in the mirror and sit down and really figure out where your priorities are. So I think that pops its head up. And I think that it can be directly traced to that idea that regulation means we can't be innovative or we can't have an edge, which just isn't the case, right?
And then there's also the historical reality that regulations will be developed in response to a problem, which will inevitably come up because of the way these systems are being developed. So instead of waiting for a big bad problem to happen and then having to embed regulations in to avoid the legal nightmare that comes from having developed a system like that, just be a little bit anticipatory and say, sure, I'm happy to abide by regulation that says that my system is not going to inadvertently kill 1,000 people. I don't think that's unreasonable. But
it's
that's
not an
just
unreasonable ask. But that's you and me trying to be reasonable. We're not developing our own systems to kill thousands of people.
I think you and I just don't understand innovation the way they do.
I guess not. And that's
which
part
begs
of
the question of what is innovation, right? If you're saying that regulation hampers innovation, what exactly is innovation to you? Because we must have different definitions of that.
I think that's part of it. And it's like we want this unfettered, and it's like this free market capitalist narrative that is just like the Silicon Valley approach to move fast and break things. That means like I am entitled to break things. then I am entitled to move fast in order to, and that can work in certain spaces, but this is a sector. Military do very high risk things, like the highest risk, right? We're talking about life and death decision making. So we generally, one would say, we want to be very careful with how we were innovating in the space. And I think this also goes to another sort of trope that we've seen in other spaces, that these products are being developed and sold and marketed as like a hammer, and then every problem starts looking like a nail. It would be more refreshing to see military saying, okay, what problem do we have to solve? And then let's find a tailor-made, technologically advanced solution for that. Instead, this is also kind of very related to work I've done on armed drones over the years, is that once you have one, then everything kind of starts looking like a nail. And then you can use them here. And you wouldn't have necessarily used an F-35 or a fighter jet in that space, but this drone offers different possibilities. So we're going to start using it more. And the more that we start using these technologies, and the more spaces, we see blurred lines, we see the civilian, the policing sector bleeding into militarization much more here. And I'm quite concerned, because I think that that's only going to lead to more conflict in the long run.
I think there's also a huge part of the fear of falling behind. There's a hype around these kinds of technologies and, back to that industry narrative of the way that they're sold and things like that. I imagine that a lot of states are like, well, we have to adopt this technology and we have to implement it because we cannot fall behind. And then I think that's how we get to the point of what you said, where everything starts to look like a nail. So everything starts to look like a problem that AI could solve. And when you actually get into the nitty-gritty of it and you realize the complications of using these systems, especially in absence of regulations, there are huge repercussions to them. So we're seeing this in Gaza, right? The IDF have used AI DSS in Gaza, and it's been reported that the inaccuracies of these systems have increased the civilian death toll. That's a reality of this system. That is a reality of an unregulated system that has been put into deployment in a way that no other system would, right? If you had a gun that was as inaccurate as this AI DSS, it would not be put into deployment. They'd be like, this is too inaccurate. We can't use it. So why is it that we have these standards for other weapon systems and not for AI? And this is one of the critical questions you and I have put forward in a lot of these forums. Why is it that we have standards and benchmarks for other weapon systems, but we seem to have forgotten them for AI and for autonomy? What is the difference between these two types of weapon systems? And it's really interesting to see people respond to that.
Yeah, and I think that I've been in many different spaces with military actors and personnel, people who are genuinely beholden to IHL. They believe in the system and we need to comply with it. But at the same time, like, I get this argument often of like, it's not the technology in Gaza that's the problem. It's the way that Israel might be interpreting its legal obligations, which I would agree. I think it's both. That it's first a horribly, I would say, a bastardized interpretation of what their legal obligations are with respect to protecting civilians, the duty of constant care, principles of precautions, proportionality. But then that's exacerbated by this technological capability, right? So when, and that's what goes back to like, guns don't kill people, people kill people. But I would argue and I would wager that people with guns, certain automatic weapons, are going to have the ability, they want to kill more people than somebody with a knife or a revolver, right? Like, so to understand the arguments that sort of unwrap this idea that it's not a technology. And like, also this plays into, well, the way they might be doing it is horrible, but we're the responsible user. And I'm like, what ensures that? Like, what's your robust?
What is your benchmark for responsible if it's not IHL?
Well, if it is IHL, but it's a very like minimal reading of IHL, and that's the work that I've been trying to do.
Their own interpretation of it.
Yeah, an interpretation that does not put a robust understanding of the protection of civilians. Like, it has completely gone out of balance toward the sort of military necessity side, which I think is a poor reading of IHL. I think it doesn't take into account the object and purpose of why we have the Geneva Conventions in the first place and the additional protocols. And if you're not doing it like that, in my view, you're doing it wrong. And that's why I try to tie all of this stuff into civilian harm mitigation and response, not just because, of course, we all agree it's not okay to be killing civilians, but it's also tied intimately to the legitimacy of military operations. If you do better to comply with your obligations to protect civilians in wartime, then your operations will be perceived as more legitimate. And that is whether you're using an AI-enabled technology, autonomous system, or just a conventional platform. And I think, to understand it in those terms, like that takes time, it takes nuance, it takes conversations, and that's really at odds with the speed at which this stuff is developing. And that hits on your point of earlier, like, that everybody's afraid to fall behind. We're in like this new arms race. And I just feel like if we could all just take a deep breath and slow down. And I know that that's at tension right now, but I think there are operational, strategic, tactical risks of moving at machine speed. Like not just in an operation, but also trying to innovate and develop and acquire this technology at such a fast pace. You're losing sight of your strategic and your priorities, right? Like, unless your priority is don't fall behind China. But is that a wise long-term goal? I mean, maybe, but why? And can you explain why? I
I
missed
think
that
the
one.
US's AI action plan that was released almost blatantly said we must not fall behind China. But what's interesting to me about what you're talking about with, the scale of these technologies and at what cost, from a system safety engineering perspective, which is my background, I find it absolutely fascinating that we are bulldozing ahead with inadequate systems. If I gave you a calculator and told you this calculator was wrong 7 out of 10 times, how many people would actually buy that calculator? Probably not many. Most people, well, I want a calculator that's right 9.999 out of 10 times, right? That's the purpose of this calculator.
10
And I
out of
find
10
it
would be good.
baffling, right? And I find it baffling that we have these technologies that are proven to not be accurate at the percentage that we need them to be or at the rate that we need them to be. They have proven to be limited in their capacity. And yet for some reason, the narrative is speed and scale and let's adopt it and this is great and this is fair. Where did the flip happen? Because it's not making logical sense to me, especially in a military context. We put millions and billions of dollars into these kinds of technology and you're telling me that you can only get something that's 50 or 60% accurate? Where is your money going? This is not an effective use of your resources. And it's wild to me that we're even having to point this out and have this conversation, because militaries have been the epitome of technology for a really, really long time. Like the aviation industry, for example, that came out of World War II. The civil aviation industry came out of World War II. World War I and World War II really set the precedents for how those technologies scaled, and it was after World War II that we got the civil aviation industry. So the military has a very long history of progressing technology. GPS is another really good example, right? That started in the military context and then got pushed out into the civil domain. This one's a little bit different. We're kind of seeing the civil and the military domain bleed into one another.
Yeah.
And the difference with the other two is that, yes, of course, we had some trial and error and some hiccups with aviation and with GPS, but they were remedied and they were fixed. And there was an acknowledgement of these things that needed to be fixed in order to be improved. And that acknowledgement was there because it was like, well, we want to win these wars and we need to win these wars with state-of-the-art technology, and our technology is currently not there. And
Right.
now here we are decades later, and it's like, we need to win these wars with this super agentic AI. I don't know what the new buzzwords are. Honestly, I've lost track. But this is how they're going forward. We will win these wars with the super duper wonderful AI that's accurate 57% of the time. But it's still good. It's fine. We'll put millions of dollars into it. Yeah. So
And this is
I
where
just don't get where this happened.
I think this is totally on point because I can't understand, I can't square the circle either. And I think, and that this is where I'm really trying to engage with military personnel who are trying to develop and acquire this stuff. Like, these are the questions for them. They are mostly concerned with reliability. They need to know that that system will function the way that it needs to function, not for any sort of protection of civilians necessarily, but so that they can carry out their operation. And if it's not able to do that, I also don't understand it. But I think there are two things, one of which, the current conflicts in which these are being fielded at the moment in Gaza and in Ukraine. The Gaza context, I'm not certain that the IDF is concerned with actual interpretation of IHL. And if that's not your strategic interest and it's horrific and it's illegal and we all should ask for accountability on that, and that's what I've been doing generally speaking. But if that's not baked into how you will use these technologies, 57% accuracy isn't really problematic to you. And that sounds very cold-hearted, but it is also true. I don't think that's the case for other military actors, but they are at this point talking in sort of hypotheticals, right? They're trying to innovate and get this technology to a place where it will be reliable if they have to field it. But within the European context, for example, everything is couched in terms of a potential large-scale combat operation with the Russians. That's where our innovation is going. That's where all the money is going. The 5% NATO norm. This has all become part of this sort of march or inevitability of war, right? We're on war footing. We're on a war path. We should prepare. And I get that, and I'm sympathetic to that. You should prepare for things that seem more imminent than they were 10 years ago. On the other side of it, we've got to do this with a modicum of reality, right? Like, to understand what this realism is, that it doesn't need to be a blind, like, let us go in and get all the tech, because again, you lose your strategic footing. Because what are we doing? And does every single country in Europe need to acquire these kinds of technologies? Maybe, but for what reason? And I've seen it also, I think there are geopolitical contexts, of course, we can't forget, like Maven Smart Systems. The US was the leader on that. They're using them currently. They're using this technology currently in the Red Sea against the Houthi rebel general. But NATO recently acquired it, and I'm trying to find out more information about, well, what kind of legal reviews went on with this. So it's acquired at the NATO level. And Palantir is part and parcel of this particular acquisition and the technological development. But then, like, so this is acquired at the NATO level, but also because the US has been using this for a long time. Like, it's sort of a trickle down interoperability. It's like, well, if you want to be part of this alliance, you need to also participate in the Palantir scheme, et cetera. So that's what we've seen here in the Dutch context recently. It's become known that they've been working with Palantir systems for 11 years now, the Dutch military. But a lot of that argument is, well, we need to be, we're forced into a position where we have to be interoperable with the big partner. So I think there are so many layers to unpack here, but I still don't think people are taking the time to slow down and ask, do we really need it? Just because we can now, does that mean we should? And those aren't popular questions. Nobody has time.
No. No, they're not popular questions. They're difficult to answer, and they challenge people's newly accepted worldview. And the newly accepted worldview is that AI is the solution to all the problems we didn't know we had.
So how do we fix it, Zena?
I have no idea. I think the most that we can do is to continue to do what we do. You know, we are in a fortunate position in that we have representation on these kinds of international forums, and so we can try and be a voice of pragmatism and a voice of reason. And I don't know about you, but I do find in my experience that most of the people who are there do want similar things. So, you know, when we do come in and we clarify things and we try to have these kinds of discussion, most of the people want to engage and want to have those discussions. And while they might not be easy, I do think that there is traction for it. So I think that's the only thing we can do, is to continue to try and be some form of representation for pragmatic discussions.
I just want to belabor the point. We've got to slow down. We've got to slow it down. We cannot be operating at machine speed, because that's when we lose our own added value as humans at this, which is the qualitative analogical reasoning that we bring to the table, the critical thinking skills. That's never going to be purview of a machine. It won't be. It's not now, nor will it be. And that's where we need to kind of really step back into our spotlight as humans to say, this is what we do best. So you need to keep that within our wheelhouse and not try to start farming that stuff out. But, and you know, I have seen, again, back to being ever the optimist, I've seen some actors, some military actors in this space, in our field, who used to be very pro, tech will save us, let's go all in on it. I've seen recent nuance. I've seen shifts. I've seen a bit of that reason starting to come into the discourse, slowing it down, having a 360 view is a better approach, also from an operational and strategic But that's been the last 2 years of a conversation, right? So that's taken that long to get there. It's not all solved, but I mean, I think it's a good indication of like through these kinds of conversations, like you said, that's the only thing we can do, and we should keep doing it. And if it all fails, then I'm just going to open a bakery, if that's okay.
When I was a kid, I wanted to be a pastry chef.
Look, I think we can open this venture together. If it all fails, we're going to open a bakery together.
I want to make fun pastries. Have you seen those videos online of people eating beautiful desserts, the ones that look like a mango or look like a lemon, or I don't know, they always look like a fruit, which I find really ironic.
They blow my mind, the people, and the fact that like you can take so much time to make something and then just eat it. And I love that.
Our bakery can be really comical, and we can have desserts that look like ChatGPT, like the interface of ChatGPT.
We can go wild with this. I like it. You do
think so.
I'm going to make cheesecake. I'm just going to make one thing and I'm going to make it very well.
Just cheesecake.
Variations on cheesecake, salted caramel, a fruit, these kinds of things.
Do one thing, do it well.
Do one thing, do it well.
Well, I think this is the perfect segue then into our last question, which is the question that I ask all of my guests. And it is, what is one piece of advice that you have for people for engaging with technology safely and responsibly? So what is your one responsible bite?
Get uncomfortable by asking questions of other disciplines. And I think I've highlighted it throughout this podcast, but it's a weird place to be if you're an expert at something and you step somewhere else and you're not the expert. That can be uncomfortable, but that's okay. Like that's where the learning is happening. So be uncomfortable, ask the questions. People, increase your knowledge base, but also increase your collaborative space. This is how you and I found each other, really. And we're just on the path to change the world. So that was through my willingness to ask the questions, your willingness to give me the answers that I needed to deepen my knowledge base. I think we all want to share our own expertise with others, especially if they're open and willing to. So I just want to encourage people, dip your toes in, the water's more, and then you'll learn more and we'll have a better, more higher quality conversation about this stuff, which is really needed.
Over cheesecake.
Over cheesecake and pastries that look like fruits.
Or the ChatGPT interface.
It's our next venture.
One or the other.
Our side gig. I love it.
All right, that's wonderful. You've been amazing, Jess. Thank you so much. Thank you for giving us an update and overview of last week, which I know was a super intensive week for you, but this has been a fantastic conversation. So thank you so much. And for all of our listeners, I will leave all of Jess's details and where you can find her in the show notes. But thank you again.
Thank you for having me. I love this. I'll do it anytime if you need me back on the show.
I'm going to hold you to that. We're going to have a second episode for sure.
Sounds good.